When it comes to the world of wrestling, everyone wants to be great. And why not? After all, it's a highly competitive field, and the better you're considered to be, the more money you're going to make at the end of the day. That said, for as many greats as there are out there, only one can be considered the GOAT of each individual promotion. And while the reasons for this can vary, with some being great in-ring workers, others being better with promos, and others just being more legitimate in the way they carry themselves, they each stand alone atop the mountain with no one able to touch them. But who are these wrestlers? Well, that's exactly the question we're looking to answer today. So join us as we cover every major company North America has ever had to offer in Who's the GOAT? Every promotion's greatest wrestler. And since we're focusing on North America today, we may as well start off with the biggest company of them all on this continent as, across several decades and 3 different incarnations now, WWE has remained the top dog when it comes to wrestling. But while we'll get to who comes out number 1 in its prior WWWF and WWF forms in a moment, when it comes to the current day, there's no one who can stand any higher on the totem pole than John Cena. Yes, ever since he debuted with Vince McMahon's company in 2002, Big Match John has largely been seen as the personification of what it would become post-Attitude Era. And though a certain section of the fan base weren't always behind him with this, it's undeniable how big of a star he's gone on to be. How did he do this? Well, like Hulk Hogan before him, he'd get the kids on his side, something which was hugely important as, with WWE going in far more PG direction as the 2000s bled into the 2010s, things would be marketed towards the younger demographic much harder once again. Of course, this would necessitate he change his character up at a certain point because, with his early days on the roster seeing him portray the heelish Doctor of Thugonomics, kids weren't as inclined to get behind him in the same way. So when he morphed into the ultimate babyface then, one who always did the right thing, never gave up, and preached hustle, loyalty, and respect, all this changed, and suddenly Cena rocketed to the top of the card as the biggest star the company had seen since a certain person we'll get to in a moment. But unlike that person, the Massachusetts native would have a lengthy run on top, with him remaining the guy until the end of the 2010s, during which time he would hold 16 world titles, have legendary bouts against the likes of CM Punk, AJ Styles, Edge, Batista, Randy Orton, The Rock, Brock Lesnar, and countless others, and also set a record for the most Make-A-Wish appearances in the history of that organization. That's right, even when he was getting booed by adult males in the arena, John always knew that he had to keep fighting for the kids. And in the end, this consistency and commitment to his role would even see those who'd once jeered him start to get behind him towards the end of his run, with him by then being recognized as the Babe Ruth of WWE. That said, like Babe Ruth, Cena is never going to be able to last forever, and so this is why, in recent years, he's entered into semi-retirement, moving over to Hollywood and starting a career for himself there, all while letting Roman Reigns take up the mantle of the new top dog in the company. But while the length of John Cena's run on top is going to be hard for anyone to ever match again, one thing he'll never be able to achieve is the sheer level of insanity which occurred anytime our next subject's entrance music hit. And that's because when it came to popularity and overness with fans, no one did it better than the GOAT of WWF, Stone Cold Steve Austin. That's right, more so than Hulk Hogan, more so than The Rock, it was the Texas Rattlesnake who stood head and shoulders above everyone else when Vince McMahon's company was in its most popular incarnation. But then, given he was the guy who pretty much rescued WWF from bankruptcy and catapulted them into the most successful period in its history, the Attitude Era, this should come as no surprise to anyone. In fact, you could make a solid argument that, out of everyone on this list, Austin stands as the GOAT of GOATs. But it wasn't always this way though, as when he first came into the company in 1995 as the ringmaster, few would have been able to foresee where things were going. Of course, he always knew he had it in him though. All it took was a change in character as, after morphing into a more vicious, uncaring heel persona and cutting one of the most iconic promos in wrestling history at King of the Ring 1996, Stone Cold would begin getting over with fans in a big way. That said, with Vince McMahon still hoping to present him as a heel at this point, the boss spent the first few months fighting these reactions, with both him and Austin doing everything they could to get him booed here. With this being the late 90s, however, all that did was get him even more over. And so it was that by 1997, he'd have become the great anti-hero of his time, someone who would regularly stab people in the back and then spit in their face, and be all the more beloved for it. So beloved would he be, in fact, that by 1998, when he became WWF champion for the first time and entered into a feud with Vince McMahon himself, he'd arguably be even more over than Hulk Hogan was at his peak. And this meant the company was quickly rocketed into mainstream success once more, as wrestling suddenly became the cool thing to talk about everywhere, and playgrounds were filled with kids wearing Austin 316 shirts. Even when the man who would ultimately go on to become his greatest rival, The Rock, came along, the Rattlesnake still remained the top guy in the company throughout the turn of the millennium. And given how massively popular the Great One would be himself, this just goes to show how over Austin was. Seriously, no one in history has ever gotten bigger reactions than him. And if you want an example of this, just go back and watch the January 4th, 1999 episode of Raw and focus on the crowd when the glass shatters at the end of the WWF title match between The Rock and Mankind. If you listen carefully, you can just about hear his theme music playing. That said, while he would go on to become a 6-time world champion and a record 3-time Royal Rumble winner by the time 2001 rolled around, Austin's time would unfortunately be coming to a close by then, as, with a neck injury he'd suffered during a match against Owen Hart a few years prior never really healing fully, it meant that come 2003, he'd have to hang up his boots. But given how popular he was during the Attitude Era, surely there's no one in the prior iteration of WWF that could compete with him then. Well, while some would argue for that being the case, there are others who would state that when Vince McMahon Sr. was in charge of the show and the company was known as the Worldwide Wrestling Federation, no one could come close to being as big of a deal as Bruno Sammartino. Yes, if Austin was the guy for the late 90s crowd, then Sammartino was nothing less than a god for Italian Americans living in New York in the 60s and 70s. And that was largely because, during an era where kayfabe was still a closely guarded secret, and many in attendance believed that what they were watching was a real fight, no one could ever manage to beat him. Seriously, to this day, Bruno holds the record for longest world title reign in history as, after first becoming WWWF World Champion in May of 1963, after that company had seceded from the National Wrestling Alliance, he'd go on an insanely long 2,803-day run with the title, beating absolutely everybody who stood in his path throughout this near 8-year period and becoming an icon in the process. And the length of this reign is still record-holding to this day as it happens, with it being unlikely anyone will ever come close to matching it now. Still, all good things must come to an end eventually, and so it was that in 1971, after feeling like he needed some time away from the ring, Bruno would agree to drop the belt to Ivan Koloff on January 18th of that year. But while he prepared himself for no longer being the champ at this point, fans hadn't had the same luxury, and so, when he was pinned in Madison Square Garden that night, the live audience would be left in stunned silence, in a moment which wouldn't be replicated until over 4 decades later, when Brock Lesnar beat The Undertaker at WrestleMania 30. That said, this still wouldn't be the end of Sammartino's run, as after taking a year off to recuperate, he'd returned to WWWF in late 1972, there quickly regaining his title from the, at the time, champion Stan Stasiak, and going on to hold it for a further 1,237 days. Of course, it should go without saying then that these title reigns combined makes him the undisputed GOAT of the Vince McMahon Sr. era, so much so that when Bob Backlund had to try and live up to the Italian-born star when he finally retired in 1978, business would begin to fall for the New York company, as fans had become accustomed to seeing their hero on top by then. Still though, that attitude would change as the 1980s came around and Vince McMahon Jr. took things in a much more sports entertainment direction, one which saw the rise of household names such as Hulk Hogan, Macho Man Randy Savage, and Rowdy Roddy Piper. But while the Rock and Wrestling era would prove to be a huge success for the World Wrestling Federation, it would see their main competition at the time, Jim Crockett Promotions, struggle to stay afloat. And that was because, with them being the last real bastion of the National Wrestling Alliance by this point, they'd continue to focus on more old-school style wrestling. So how did they survive for as long as they did then? Well, because they had the undisputed GOAT of the NWA on their roster, none other than Ric Flair. Sure, given the amount of talent who worked for NWA territories during that era, you could easily make a case for the likes of Harley Race, Lou Thez, or even Buddy Rogers as the greatest wrestler of the NWA. But for our money, no one ever did it better than the Nature Boy. And that's because not only is he arguably the greatest in-ring performer in history, someone who was able to have regular classics against the likes of Ricky Steamboat, Terry Funk, Dusty Rhodes, and countless others, but he might also have been the best promo too, with him being able to talk just about anyone into an arena if he was given a microphone and 5 minutes of airtime. Yes, whether it be with a tear in his eye or a pair of alligator shoes he was desperately trying to hold down, no one, save possibly the American Dream, was a better promo than the Rolex-wearing, diamond ring-wearing, kiss-stealing, wheelin'-dealin', limousine-riding, jet-flying son of a gun. But while you would think being pretty much unparalleled both as a wrestler and a talker would be enough to make someone the GOAT, what really pushed Flair over the top was the way he excelled at making everyone he went up against look like $1 million, as being the traveling NWA World's Champion throughout his various runs between 1981 and 1993, he'd regularly be counted on to go into another territory and face off against their top babyface. That said, even if he would make them seem like a killer, he'd usually come out with the title around his waist by the end of things anyway, because as the dirtiest player in the game, he always had a backup waiting to help him out in the form of wrestling's first ever supergroup, the Four Horsemen. And this all meant that with fans eventually coming to love him despite his heelish antics, he'd become the person most closely associated with the NWA and the big gold belt, which by then had served as his world title. Even today, in fact, if that particular belt makes an appearance on WWE, or if the National Wrestling Alliance is ever brought up somewhere else, the Nature Boy is probably the first person who will come to mind for most fans. But as time went on and WCW moved away from the NWA, Flair's times there would come to an end too. And while he would later find equal levels of success both there and in WWE, as far as the once mighty governing body of the wrestling world was concerned, they'd have to settle for surviving by aligning themselves with an at-the-time upstart promotion in total non-stop action wrestling. So being charged with keeping the legacy alive for a while longer then, TNA and Impact Wrestling, as it would later be rebranded, would attempt to forge their own path with a group of young, homegrown performers. And as it turned out, none of these would be better than the undisputed top guy there, AJ Styles. That's right, while he may never have been the biggest star in the Nashville-based promotion, especially after the likes of Hulk Hogan and Eric Bischoff came along to drown everything in a sea of ex-WWE stars, AJ always stood high above everyone else as the heart and soul of the whole operation. How did he do this? By always being there and always putting on excellent performances night in and night out, whether he was being appreciated by management or not. In fact, amongst these performances would be the match which is generally accepted to be the greatest in TNA history, with that being the triple threat bout between him, Christopher Daniels, and Samoa Joe at 2009's Turning Point pay-per-view. Not that this was the only classic he would have during his time down south though, as, aside from this, there would be his excellent encounters against the likes of Low Ki, Frankie Kazarian, and Christian Cage, each of which only helped to further his case for being the best wrestler of his generation. Hell, so good was he that even if he'd never been in WWE at this point, TNA couldn't ignore his popularity altogether, and that was why, on 5 separate occasions, he'd win their world title. Then, as time went on and the company's reputation began to dour in many fans' eyes, they could always at least count on him to be the undisputed ace of the promotion and the one person who could give them a reason to keep tuning in. Of course, as far as AJ himself was concerned at this point, despite being aligned on screen with the likes of Kurt Angle and Ric Flair in stables such as the Angle Alliance and Fortune, there was always the feeling that he was never really being consistently pushed as the star he truly was. And in the end, that would be one of the major contributing factors towards him leaving Impact in 2014, at this point going on to become an even bigger star in both New Japan and the WWE. After that then, Impact would never be able to find the same levels of success again, something which just goes to show how much of a game changer AJ really was for them, and how stupid they ultimately were to let him slip through their fingers. That said, TNA aren't the only company who are guilty of this, as for a while, it looked like the very same thing could be said about a promotion under the WWE banner too. And that was because when it looked as though a certain Rebel Heart decided to leave NXT in 2021, fans bemoaned it as being the end of an era. Why was that? Well, in the Black and Gold brand, no one had ever been able to capture fans' attention in quite the same way as Johnny Gargano had. But given how great of a natural babyface he is, this shouldn't really come as a surprise. After all, it's been evident since his early days on the roster in 2015. Of course, at that point, he was known as something of a tag team specialist, because with his loyal friend Tommaso Ciampa by his side, the two would go on to form DIY, a highlight of an incredibly stacked division which also featured the likes of the Revival and American Alpha. As time went on, though, it would be as an underdog single star that Gargano became more commonly known as, because when Ciampa turned heel on him at May 2017's TakeOver Chicago, Johnny Wrestling would go through a lengthy period of losing his confidence. And this would see him be forced to work his way back up from the bottom again then, gradually picking up wins over the next few months, all up until the point that he got a shot at the NXT title, then being held by Andrade Cien Almas. Unfortunately for Johnny, however, the constant bane in his side, Tommaso Ciampa, would be there to lay him out once again here, causing the two to then splinter off into having perhaps the most celebrated feud in the history of the brand, and one of the best storylines WWE has done in years. Sure, it would have its flaws that were largely out of the performer's control, such as when injuries or global shutdowns constantly stopped them from getting to have the big climax they deserved. But in the end, none of that would really matter because, after years of being seen in fans' eyes as the heart and soul of NXT, Gargano would finally get the gold to back this up when, at TakeOver New York on April 5th, 2019, he'd defeat Adam Cole to finally win the big one. And from there, as NXT morphed into being more of a direct competitor to the then fledgling All Elite Wrestling, Johnny Wrestling would serve as a key player in Triple H's arsenal, one who could always be counted on to put on a great match and get fans heavily invested in what he was doing. Yes, even when he was turning heel and forming his own stable named The Way, he'd still be the one everyone knew was the guy on the black and gold brand. And that was why, when he made his exit in December of 2021, it seemed like the final nail in the coffin of a place that was, by then, a shadow of its former self. Of course, since this point, he's joined the main roster under the new Triple H regime, proving that he's still got what it takes to be a star, even after taking a lengthy break following the birth of his son. But while he's been busy rebranding himself on Raw, over on Wednesday nights, AEW, a company which has recently been going through some difficult times following the backstage antics of CM Punk and others, has found themselves returning to a man who, let's face it, has always been the ace of the company, and that's none other than Jon Moxley. Yes, put some respect on his name because while Punk may be the bigger star, and the likes of Kenny Omega and Bryan Danielson might technically be better in-ring wrestlers, nobody has the aura that Mox does whenever he comes out to the ring through the crowd, just like the man of the people he is, all to the tune of Wild Thing. Really, he's the closest thing we have to a modern-day Steve Austin. And this has meant that, since joining Tony Khan's company at their first ever event, Double or Nothing, in May of 2019, he's been treated like one of its top stars. Hell, it's also why, in February of 2020, he'd be chosen as the man to finally dethrone then AEW World Champion Chris Jericho. And when the world would go into shutdown almost immediately after this, it would be Jon Moxley who would be tasked with carrying the ball throughout one of the darkest times in recent memory, something he did each and every week with ease. But it's not just AEW he's been working for throughout this time either, because further expanding the brand all across the world, he's ventured out to other promotions, like Game Changer Wrestling and New Japan Pro Wrestling, the latter of which saw him prove his company had the best level of competition when he became the IWGP United States Champion for a time. And when CM Punk went down to injury in the summer of 2022 and someone had to be called upon to pick up the baton, it was Jon Moxley who did so, as after defeating Hiroshi Tanahashi at June 26th's Forbidden Door, he'd become the interim champion while the voice of the voiceless was out recovering. That said, for a man who had by this point formed one of the best stables in the industry today in the Blackpool Combat Club, one which also included Bryan Danielson, Wheeler Yuta, Claudio Castagnoli, and William Regal, interim was never going to be good enough. And so when Punk returned to action on the August 24th episode of Dynamite, Mox would squash him in under 5 minutes, starting off his second official reign as the champ. Then, when Punk won the title back at All Out, then was immediately stripped of it following a shoot confrontation with the Elite backstage, it would be Mox who was once again given the ball, as with him by this point proving that he was the guy who could be relied on no matter what. Tony Khan felt comfortable making him the first ever 3-time world champion in AEW history. But of course, he's not the only person in All Elite Wrestling who has an argument for being the GOAT, though in the case of Sting, his claim comes from his years prior to this when he was working for WCW. Really though, Steve Borden's time down south stretches back to when the promotion that would go on to become World Championship Wrestling was still known as Jim Crockett Promotions. And it was there that, during an early feud with Ric Flair in the late 80s, he'd proved that he had what it took to become the top babyface in the whole company. So when it finally morphed into WCW a few years later then, Sting would be more than ready to pick up the mantle of ace from the Nature Boy after he decided to take a brief detour over to WWF. And with the ball now in his court then, the Stinger would go on to become a multiple-time WCW World Champion, all while having further classic matches against the likes of Vader and Cactus Jack. But that's all from the Surfer era of his character, of course, a phase of his career which has almost become secondary compared to what would come next. And what was it that would come next? Well, this took form in 1995, as after having been the beating heart of the promotion for so many years, the Stinger would be personally offended when his loyalty to WCW was questioned during the NWO's hostile takeover attempt. So by this point then, he'd retreat from the situation entirely, with him from there spending the next 15 months sitting in the rafters with a baseball bat in hand, all while dressed in a black and white outfit reminiscent of that worn by Brandon Lee in The Crow. Yes, while his company was dying, Sting would act as a living eulogy to them, all up until the point that he decided he could take no more, of course, as in October of 1996, he'd finally rappel down to the ring to pick a side in the war, with this side being WCW. And what followed then was a slow build-up to a match between him and NWO leader Hollywood Hogan at Starrcade 1997, the most anticipated match in wrestling at that point since Hogan and Andre over a decade prior. But while the climax of this story would end up being massively botched, it ultimately saw Sting come out on top in the end, proving that he was the GOAT of WCW after all. Sadly though, after this, the company would take a nosedive, something which led to it eventually going out of business entirely in 2001. And as it happened, it wasn't the only major US wrestling promotion going out of business in 2001. Though even by then, when it was clear that Extreme Championship Wrestling was finished, the undisputed GOAT of the company, Tommy Dreamer, would remain by their side. Of course, it wasn't always the case that the innovator of violence would be treated like the ace of ECW though, because back during his early days there in 1993 and 1994, he'd be considered little more than a pretty boy wannabe, certainly not someone who had the killer instinct required to get over with the rabid Philadelphia crowd. That would all change, however, when he came up against the Sandman, as it was during this feud that Dreamer was forced to tap into his more hardcore side. How would he do this? Well, by losing a match to his rival in mid-1995 and, as per the pre-match stipulation, taking 10 lashes with a Singapore cane. And visibly being able to see the welts form on his body as he took each strike then, fans would start to get behind him as a newfound respect for what he was willing to do was formed. From there, it would be off to the races, as over the next 2 years, Dreamer would have a lengthy feud with Raven, one which saw the heel seek revenge after having been bullied by him at school in the years prior. Yes, it was flipping the traditional script to have the former jock be the babyface. But in this instance it worked, as with Tommy now being so beloved by the fans, they'd cheer him on each time he fought Raven. Even if no matter what he did, he could never quite manage to get that victory come the end of things. At least he got the girl though, because during this program, Dreamer would form an alliance with Beulah McGillicuddy, someone who later went on to become his real-life wife. And, in the end, with her by his side to motivate him, all his years of fighting it out with his chief rival would finally pay off, as in 1997, on Raven's last night with the company, the innovator of violence would finally get a pinfall victory over him, with this then spurring him on to go for an even greater prize thereafter. Yes, one thing Dreamer had never done was win the world title. So after years of circling around the edges of the title scene, he'd finally get his moment when at April 22, 2000's ScyberSlam, he'd defeat Taz to finally win the big one, solidifying himself right there and then as the GOAT of Extreme. Of course, a year after that though, ECW would be dead. And as a result, this left a hole in the North American indie scene for a while thereafter. In fact, this hole wouldn't be filled at all until a year later in 2002 when, at this point, Ring of Honor was born. And in many ways, we've saved this one for last because it's the hardest one to pick a GOAT for. Sure, you could go for the megastar in CM Punk, or you can just as equally go for the greatest in-ring wrestler alive today in Bryan Danielson. That said, while each of these certainly deserves the roses, no one defined ROH and put it on the map quite the way Samoa Joe did. How did he do this? Well, by legitimizing it mainly. After all, back in 2002, the fledgling promotion was still trying to find its own identity. So with them hoping to differentiate themselves from their much larger competitor WWE by presenting the company as more of a sports-based style then, it would be left to the bookers to try and decide which star would best fit this bill and would be able to represent them around the world as its champion. And as it happened, after early champions such as Low Ki and Xavier did an admirable job of setting the ball in motion, it would be Joe who took that ball and ran with it straight into the end zone as, beginning in March of 2003, he'd go on a 645-day run as ROH champion, with this still being the longest reign for that particular title to this day, and, in many people's eyes, the greatest. Of course, part of the reason it was so great though was that during this 2-year period, the champ would defend the belt outside of the US for the first time, formally making it a world title in the process. And on top of that, pretty much every defense he had would turn out to be an absolute banger, because with his hard-hitting martial arts-inspired offense, it made for easy classics against the likes of Austin Aries and CM Punk, the latter of which would give Ring of Honor its first ever 5-star match. So by the time he lost the title to Aries in December of 2004 then, Samoa Joe had more than done his job in solidifying ROH as the #1 independent wrestling promotion in North America. But that didn't mean he was done quite yet, because from there he'd go on to have further classic feuds against his one-time protege Jay Lethal and All Japan Pro Wrestling legend Kenta Kobashi, with this latter one being such a brutal spectacle that it would later go on to be voted as Match of the Year by readers of Dave Meltzer's Wrestling Observer newsletter. And while he would leave to go start a new chapter of his career in TNA soon after this, it wouldn't mark the last time he was ever seen inside an ROH ring, as since signing up to AEW in 2002, he's been able to make appearances at his former home once more, now that they're owned by Tony Khan also. In fact, as it stands, he's currently the Ring of Honor Television Champion, and with the speculation being that he's eventually going to go up against current ROH World Champion Chris Jericho in a title versus title match at some point, we wouldn't be surprised to see him have a second reign with the top prize before all is said and done. Before we go though, we want to know who you think the GOAT of each company is. Maybe you think it deserves to be Hulk Hogan for WWF. Maybe you think it deserves to be Bryan Danielson for ROH, or maybe someone else altogether. Whatever you think, we have no doubt that it's an argument which will continue to rage on for some time to come, because when it comes down to it, everyone wants to stake their claim for being the best.